Once again, we look at the book of Yehoshua. And in today's readings, Yehoshua has taken yet another turn. Having established the territorial boundaries of the tribes of Yehuda and Yosef, it is now time to divide up the remaining land into 7 portions for the remaining tribes. Before Yehoshua embarks on drawing lots, we see that the whole community has moved from Gilgal up to Shiloh. That was a crucial step because the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, remained in Shiloh until the time of King David. That move is important because on 18 separate occasions in the book of Devarim, Yahweh said to Moshe that Israel were to take their sacrifices to the place that he, Yahweh, would choose. 3 times each year, the men of Israel were required to present themselves in the presence of Yahweh at the place he chose. So for the next 400 years, Shiloh is the place that Yahweh had chosen. It was the place where the Mishkan would remain and where the men of Israel would have to assemble 3 times a year. Shiloh would remain the location of the Mishkan and the dwelling place of Yahweh. And that's why Yehoshua chapter 18 verse 1 says that the entire community of the people of Israel assembled themselves together at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there, and after the land had been subdued before them. Now the entire community in verse 1 appears to include all the people. They were all still obligated to be present in Shiloh for the apportioning of the remaining territories. However, no explanation is given why the people of Yehuda and Yosef had to be present. Perhaps it was because they were to be witnesses during the apportioning of the land among the other tribes. Then in verse 3, Yehoshua makes a rather strange comment. How long will you delay in going to take possession of the land that Yahweh your God gave to your ancestors and is giving to you? It appears there may have been reluctance among those 7 tribes to accept their own inheritance. The lots had been drawn for the territories of Yehuda and Yosef. However, the words in verse 3 suggest that the other 7 tribes were perhaps to have actually taken for themselves the territory that they wanted. It is possible that the leaders of the 7 remaining tribes were reluctant to venture forth without being given direct instructions from Yehoshua. Having experienced the wrath of Yahweh back in Kadesh Barnea, following the bad reports that were received, at that time these present leaders were actually children. As a direct consequence of the spies' reports and the subsequent death of Korach and his cohort, the present leaders, now approximately 45 years later, could well have been suffering from what we nowadays call post-traumatic stress disorder. They had had such an experience as children, it's probably restraining them from taking up what is rightfully theirs. Now, whatever the reason, they needed Yehoshua to guide them, and he selected 3 men from each of the tribes to explore the land that was being offered. Their task was to go through the land, survey the cities, and write down everything they saw in a scroll and present it to Yehoshua at Shiloh. Hence, the 7 portions were distributed among the tribes by lot. However, again, Yehoshua makes it clear to the leaders that the Leviim were not to be included in the ballot system. The tribe of Levi were being singled out as a 13th tribe, who were to have no land inheritance, because they were being given the role and office of Leviim and Kohanim. Yahweh himself would be their eternal inheritance, in return for their service that they would provide on behalf of the other tribes while serving at the Mishkan. A similar pattern emerged in the 1st century CE. For all who were called by the Ruach HaKodesh to become part of the one new man, that is, the body of Yeshua. In the 1st century, the called out ones were being treated in the same manner as the whole tribe of Levi had been treated at the time of Yehoshua. In the 1st century, the Messianic community was being set apart for service to Yahweh as Kohanim in the manner of Melchizedek, which is clearly defined in Hebrews chapters 7 and 8. That is why Shaul, when speaking about the future role of the one new man, or the Messianic community, was able to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 19, being circumcised means nothing. Being uncircumcised means nothing. What does mean something is keeping God's commandments. Each person should remain in the condition in which he was called. That same statement is still applicable even today in the 21st century. All who are called by the Ruach HaKodesh to become part of the one new man are being set apart from the rest of Israel, from the rest of the nations, for the future purpose of being Kohanim, to serve Yahweh and Yeshua in the Olam Haba. Now that call applies to both Jews and Gentiles who become part of the one new man. So Shaul's words in Ephesians chapter 2 verses 15 and 16 have remained a matter of considerable discussion, particularly in the Messianic movement during the last 54 years since the Six-Day War of 1967. Many have failed to realize the full significance of the call to be part of the one new man. So drawing of the lots. Going back to the latter part of chapter 18 of Yehoshua, we find the first of the 7 lots was given to Benjamin. Verses 18 and 19 are devoted to defining the territory assigned to that tribe. And as I suggested last Shabbat, it is difficult for us in the 21st century to determine just where those named places were really located. But what we do know is that the territory of Benjamin was actually located above Yehuda and immediately below that of Yosef. The tribe of Benjamin had a total of 26 cities, including among them Jerusalem. However, Jerusalem remained in the hands of the Yevuzi until the time of King David. Also within their boundaries were the ruins of Jericho and other villages. So let's now look at chapter 19. Having established the location of the territory of Benjamin, we come now to chapter 19, which defines the portions given to the remaining 6 tribes. The chapter names the cities and villages that were occupied by each tribe, including those enumerated for the territory of Dan, the 7th tribe, and in total those tribes occupied 98 cities. Quite a number of cities taken captive. So they didn't have to build cities, they had them all there, ready and waiting for them, and all the surrounding fertile land that was producing produce. Then in verse 47, it explains how Dan expanded beyond its original allocation by saying, the territory of the descendants of Dan was too small for them, so the descendants of Dan went up and fought against Leshem, captured it, defeated it by the sword, took possession of it, and lived there, calling Leshem Dan, after Dan their ancestor. Now the reason Dan had to expand was because it ended up with the last lot drawn, which turned out to be a relatively small portion of land. If you can put up that slide for me. Oh, sorry, it's in my pocket. We'll have to pull it. Sorry about that. Right, now, Dan was far too large for the territory that he'd been given. And the portion of land which he was given, as we can see in the green, is situated between Ephraim and Yehuda and right up against the Philistines. It was a small portion of land for such a large tribe. And of course, the western boundary was along the border of the Great Sea, the coast. It was a tiny pocket, as we can see by comparison with the others. It was a tiny pocket of land for a tribe that, according to Bamidbar, or Numbers, chapter 26, verse 43, had 64,400 people. It was the second largest of the tribes. Only Yehuda, who had about 74,000, was bigger. So we can see the proportion that Yehuda had and what Dan was given is totally disproportionate. That is why we read in Yehoshua chapter 19, verse 47, some of the men of Dan went up and fought against Lashem and captured it. They took it in possession of the city and renamed it after their forefather. However, as we see in Judges chapter 18, verses 11 through 31, which we'll come to next year, the men of Dan turned their backs on Yahweh and established their own center of worship. Using a stolen silver idol, they established their form of worship in their new city of Dan. As a result, they were cast aside by Yahweh along with the tribe of Ephraim, both of whom established idol worship away from Jerusalem. When we consider the list of tribes that are numbered in Revelation chapter 7, the 144,000, we see that the two tribal names that are missing are Dan and Ephraim. And I believe this suggests that they are not counted amongst Yeshua's Kohanim for the Olam Haba because of their idol worship in the past. They will be part of the returning tribes into the land. They will possess the land, as according to Ezekiel, but they won't be providing Kohanim. Chapter 19 concludes with Israel giving Yehoshua a personal possession of the city and the hills of Ephraim, where he settled in his declining years. Then the chapter concludes with a recap of how the land had been divided between the 7 tribes by the official panel comprising Yehoshua himself and the Eleazar the Cohen and the leaders of the ancestral clans. All the territorial lots had been drawn in the presence of Yahweh at the door of the Mishkan, which by that stage, of course, was residing in Shiloh. Finally, all the tribes had their individual inheritances established, so the selection panel could now be disestablished. As we will see in chapter 22, Yehoshua decommissioned the eastern tribes who had served supporting their brothers and allowed them to return to their territory east of the Yarden River, just as Moshe had promised them and had agreed that Israel would take that portion of the land while Israel was still camped on the plains of Moab. So that brings us to chapter 20. This is a short chapter devoted to Yehoshua passing on to Israel, while they were still gathered at Shiloh, the message from Yahweh regarding the cities of refuge. Verses 3 through 6 define how the cities were to be used and the rules that would apply for anyone who was entitled to escape to those refuge cities. Each of the 6 cities was administered by the Leviim and provided refuge for anyone who had killed another person by accident. Now the person responsible for the death, if he managed to escape the next of kin of the victim, would be protected from the avenging relative. That way, justice was served because the one responsible for causing the accidental death may have been innocent, but then again he may have been guilty of what we now call manslaughter, which of course did not require a death sentence but a long-term imprisonment. But if the avenging relative had found the guilty party, he would bring punishment upon him by killing the perpetrator. Thus, these 6 cities of refuge helped to ensure that justice could be done to all parties. Whether guilty or not, the person was protected from the hands of the avenger. Conversely, if a man had murdered another by premeditation, the guilty party would be removed from the city of refuge and brought to the Beit Din, which was the court of justice presided over by the leaders of Israel and the Kohanim. Their trials were conducted before the whole community, and if found to be guilty, the murderer was put to death in an official manner on the evidence of no less than 2 witnesses. So we can see justice was meted out professionally right from the beginning. Now that brings us to this week's parashah, which does dovetail in with Yehoshua. Today the focus moves from the life and times of Yaakov towards their most favoured son, Yosef. The narrative opens when Yosef is 17 years old. Being the 11th son of Yaakov and the firstborn of Rachel, Yosef was not well liked by his brothers because they were sons of other mothers. That is, apart from Benjamin, of course, Joseph's younger brother was also the son of Rachel. The 10 half-brothers disliked Joseph, and their dislike was raised even higher when he gave a bad report about their conduct. Now there is no detail given about the reason for that bad report, but suffice to say, it caused a great deal of sibling hatred. The familial rift was even further exacerbated by the actions of both Yaakov and Yosef himself. Firstly, in chapter 37, verse 3, it says, "Now Israel," that is Yaakov, "loved Yosef most of all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a long-sleeved robe." The robe has caused considerable confusion, particularly in modern times, being portrayed as a coat of many colours and being dramatized as a stage show. However, while it is not possible to be 100% certain what the Hebrew words behind it mean, the sages have suggested and understood right through history that the robe was actually given as a status of a Cohen or priest, a role which was given before the time of Torah, was given to the firstborn of each of the families. It also is understood that the sages saw this garment as a long tunic with long sleeves that signified that the wearer was not a labourer, because the labouring people, those that worked in the fields, tended the sheep, they all wore short-sleeved garments. It was commonly used, the long-sleeve robe was commonly used by people of high status, of royalty and other significant positions in society. They were the only ones who wore long tunics with long sleeves. Doubtless this message was recognized by the 10 brothers, hence their collective hatred towards Joseph was greatly increased. Now the second situation is in verse 5, where Joseph himself further alienates himself from his brothers by sharing his dream with them. The brothers' response in verse 8 confirms the depth of hatred towards the way they felt towards him when they said, "Yes, he certainly will be king. You'll do a great job bossing us around." And thirdly, in verse 9, Joseph shares his second dream, which involves the whole family unit. And in verse 11, his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. The whole narrative, from the beginning of chapter 37 right through to the end of Yaakov's life, is one long drama that paves the way for Israel to finally return to the land of Eretz Israel under the leadership of Yehoshua. As we will continue to see as we go through the narrative in both the books of Bereshit and Yehoshua, we will see the sovereign plan of God marches on continuously as a blessing to all humankind. Through each phase of Joseph's life, there is a distinct parallel between his life and the life, death, and resurrection of Yeshua, who is, of course, none other than Yeshua ben Yosef. That was his name. So let's move on to Bereshit chapter 38. In the midst of the narrative about Yosef in chapters 37 and 39, suddenly we have chapter 38, which is all about the escapades of Yehuda. Yehuda went off from his brothers and settled near a man named Hiram. Now Adullam was a royal city of the Canaan, which was situated somewhere close to Shechem, well north of where Yaakov was living. It was in Adullam that Yehuda bore 2 sons with a Canaanite woman named Shua. The first son was and the second son Onan. Then Shua gave Yehuda a third son, Shelah. This was totally against what Yahweh intended for Yehuda. Doubtless the adversary was working hard once again. Bear in mind what we looked at last week, with Reuben having violated his father's concubine, Bilhah, and Shimon and Levi had disgraced the family by killing the men of Shechem. As we saw in that parashah, it all fell to Yehuda, the 4th son, to carry the responsibility of leadership for the family. Now, however, Yehuda has been led astray by his actions. Having produced 3 sons from the Canaanite woman, Yahweh could not use those sons to be leaders of Israel. However, as the narrative develops in chapter 38, Yehuda, through Tamar, redeems himself and produces the twins through Tamar. Finally, in verses 27 through 30, the first twin born is Peretz, an important scriptural event, because Peretz became the ancestor of Boaz and Ruth. Chapter 4, verses 18 through 21, we see the genealogy of Peretz all the way down to King David. So we see he played a very active role. It is no accident of history that it was there, because when we look at the list of people who went down to Egypt with Yaakov, Yehuda's first 2 sons, and Onan, actually died before the family went down to Egypt. So we see that they were not part of that movement down to Egypt. They were taken out of the equation. So from all this we see again that the adversary failed to confound the plans of Yahweh. The line of leadership for the nation of Israel always remained within the family of Israel itself, the family of Abraham. And that is the way that Yahweh had always intended it to be. He never wanted a Canaanite to be part of the family of Yaakov, either by birth or by adoption. So we see the sovereign plan of God still plays itself out against the actions of the adversary. So what about the tribe of Yehuda? Yahweh blessed Yehuda, and as we have seen through his son Peretz, that tribe became the line through which Yeshua was to be born. It was the tribe of Yehuda that received the first territorial inheritance in the land from Yehoshua. It was also the only tribe that returned to Eretz Israel after the 70-year exile in Babylon. And again, as we saw in Ezekiel chapter 37, Israel and Yehuda will be brought back together. The 2 sticks will be joined, as it says in verse 17. Finally, I will bring them together into one stick, single stick, and they will become one in my hand. That is Yehuda and the tribes of Joseph will be all brought back together. In these verses, we see once again that in the book of Yehoshua, the tribe of Yehudah was given a first portion of the territory, and Joseph was given the second portion. It is all part of God's sovereign plan that will ultimately be completed in the Olam Haba, or the age to come, when the adversary will no longer have any ability to deceive or corrupt, first of all Israel and then the rest of mankind. So in conclusion, we have seen from both the parashah and the chapters of Yehoshua that the sovereign plan of God will never be thwarted. The adversary has tried many different subtle techniques to deceive the people of Israel, and at every opportunity, right down until the time Yeshua ascended to his Father in heaven, the day following his resurrection, on Bikurim, the 18th day of Aviv in 30 CE. Satan had tried his utmost to prevent all that happening by trying to thwart God's sovereign plan. But from that time forward, the adversary was thrown out of heaven, down to the earth, the vicinity of the earth, and he moved his focus away from Israel towards those who'd been called to be part of the one new man, the Messianic community. It all started during the 40 years between the death of Yeshua and the destruction of the Second Temple. And it has continued right through even in this day. So we must be on guard at all times and be ready to deflect the arrows of the adversary. As we read in Kefa, 1 Kefa chapter 5 verse 8, the adversary stalks about like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. And he's always trying. So we as Talmidim of Yeshua must be constantly on guard against the subtle tactics of that enemy. By contrast, in verses 10 and 11 of Kefa, God, who is full of grace, the one who called us to his eternal glory in union with the Messiah Yeshua, will restore, establish, and strengthen you and make you firm. To him be the power forever and ever. Amen. So just as in the days of Joseph and Yehoshua, we also are promised a certain future through the love and support of Yeshua HaMashiach, and an assurance that we, like the Leviim in the time of Yehoshua, when it comes to the Olam Haba, we will become the Kohanim under the leadership of the great Kohen HaGadol, Yeshua himself, the Master, our eldest brother. Shabbat Shalom. Amen.